They said we were alone in the cosmos, a perfect, silent monument, forged from star stuff and shadow. But it is no monument. It is a sentinel, and it has just woken up.
Nobody told Private First Class Damon Reyes that the last sound he would ever hear as a fully human being would be the hiss of a syringe. Not the roar of engines, not the screaming of alarms. Not even his own voice calling out to the 37,000 men and women aboard the United Earth Expeditionary Fleet, 7th Armada. Call St. Iron Gospel, as they dissolved at 3 million degrees Celsius into something the universe no longer recognized as soldiers. Just the hiss, cold metal against skin, a burn so deep it felt like someone had replaced his blood with liquid lightning, and then nothing, then everything, then something far worse than either. Let's back up, because before you can understand what Damon Reyes became, you need to understand what the 7th Armada was. You need to feel the weight of it. 312 warships stretching across an engagement corridor 40,000 kilometers wide. Hanging in the outer shell of the Cygnus 7 system like a fist raised against the dark. You need to hear the tactical chatter of 250 bridge crews running parallel, the synchronized heartbeat of a military machine that had never once lost a system-wide engagement. You need to smell the recycled air, the coffee gone cold in zero-G, the oil-and polymer scent of freshly charged rail platforms. You need to understand that the 7th Armada was not just a fleet. It was a nation in motion. It was the concentrated will of 12 billion human beings who had looked out at a galaxy that didn't want them alive, and had collectively, stubbornly, profanely decided to show up anyway. And in 0.0003 seconds, the time it takes a human eye to complete a single blink, the Cygnus 7 star stopped burning yellow and detonated outward at 150 billion megatons. The Iron Gospel didn't burn, it evaporated. But here's what the official casualty reports will never tell you. Here's the part that was classified above top secret, above eyes only. Buried so deep in the bowels of United Earth Space Command that the document itself doesn't have a name. Just a 17-digit alphanumeric code, and the words, "Do not extract without authorization." Code Omega 9, 7 soldiers didn't die. Not because they were lucky, not because they made it to an escape pod in time. Not because some miracle of engineering shielded them from a stellar detonation that should have erased them down to the last quark. 7 soldiers didn't die because in the milliseconds before vaporization, guided by training so deep it had overwritten human instinct, they reached for a small black case bolted beneath there. Combat harnesses. A case with a red handle. A case that every soldier in every branch of United Earth Armed Forces was told, on their first day of basic training, they were never, under any circumstances, to open. The case contained a single syringe. The syringe contained the primordial ichor. And the primordial ichor, the most illegal substance in the known galaxy, banned by 6 separate interstellar treaties. Condemned by every species who had ever encountered it, is the only thing in creation that can look at a human being who has been structurally atomized by a dying star and say, "I can work with this." 700 hours, ship standard time, 36 seconds before the supernova. Commander Alexis, Lex, Hargrove of the UES Unbroken Covenant had a bad feeling that started behind her left eye and worked its way down the back of her neck like ice water. She'd had the feeling before in the Proxima engagement, in the Third Belt Siege, in every op where the intelligence briefings were too clean and the enemy was too quiet. The Vethkai were never quiet. The insectoid collective species with compound eyes the color of dying embers, and a hive mind, distributed across 11 star systems, had been harassing human expansion corridors for 20 years. They were loud, aggressive, territorial in the way that only a species operating on collective biological instinct could be, like 6 billion hornets sharing one nervous system. When Vethkai went quiet, it wasn't because they were retreating, it was because they were aiming. "Commander," Lieutenant Patel leaned over his sensor station, and even filtered through 3 layers of military composure, his voice had an edge on it. "I'm reading gravitational anomalies in the Cygnus 7 stellar core. These readings are—" he stopped, swallowed. "Ma'am, these readings shouldn't be possible." Hargrove crossed the bridge in 4 strides. She looked at the display. She looked at it for exactly 2 seconds. "All hands," she said, and her voice through the ship-wide comm was the calmest thing anyone would ever hear. "This is the commander. Deploy I-Core protocol, now." Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. I-Core protocol. The 2 words that every soldier in the fleet had memorized and never, ever expected to use. The 2 words printed in red on the underside of those black cases. The 2 words that meant conditions had degraded beyond the possibility of survival through any conventional means. Hargrove grabbed the red handle herself. In the Combat Information Center, 3 decks below her, Sergeant First Class Damon Reyes was already tearing his open. In the engine room of the Unbroken Covenant, Corporal Unez Domingspark had the syringe in her hand before Hargrove finished the second syllable of the last word. On 6 other ships scattered across the fleet, 1 destroyerman named Tekoa Williams, 1 gunnery sergeant named Brix Okafor, 1 sniper-qualified ranger named Sol Park, 1 ship's surgeon named Dr. Mara Elias, and 1 person whose rank and name were so thoroughly classified that even this story cannot speak them plainly. Those cases were already open. 7 syringes. 7 final acts of training overriding every human instinct for self-preservation. Because self-preservation was exactly what the I-Core was. The star went white. Not the warm white of overexposed sunlight, not the blue white of a welding arc. The absolute white, the white that exists at temperatures where matter no longer behaves as matter, where hydrogen and iron and carbon and the polymers of human bone all become the same unified. Screaming plasma, the white that happens when a star, guided by something, by someone, has its magnetic containment field collapse from the outside. Its fusion reactions accelerated by 11 orders of magnitude in a cascade that no natural stellar mechanics could produce. The Vethkai had not sent a fleet. They had sent a detonator. In 0.0003 seconds, the supernova's leading electromagnetic pulse shredded every electrical system in every ship in the fleet. In 0.001 seconds, the radiation front hit at near-light speed, burning through hull plating like tissue paper through a blowtorch. In 0.003 seconds, the thermal wave arrived, and at 3 million degrees Celsius, the distinction between metal and flesh and circuitry and oxygen ceased to exist in any meaningful sense. 37,000 human beings stopped in the space between one heartbeat and the next. The ship's 312 vessels ranging from 30-meter scout cutters to the 2-kilometer command carrier Manifest Doctrine became their component elements. Titanium hull plating sublimated, reactor cores detonated in sympathetic chain reactions. The contents of thousands of crew quarters, photographs, letters written by hand and never sent, a child's drawing taped above a bunk, a coffee mug from a diner in Nashville with a chip on the handle, all of it became part of the vast, glowing exhalation of a murdered star. The 7th Armada ceased to exist. The star charts were updated in real time at Space Command Headquarters in Colorado Springs. 12 billion people on Earth, and its colonies would wake up the next morning to news that the iron gospel was gone. 12 billion people would spend the next week in a grief so raw and enormous that atmospheric psychologists would later compare it to a species-wide trauma response. And in the cooling, irradiated void where the fleet had been, in the silence that was so absolute it had a texture, like velvet pressed against the inside of your skull, 7 things that had very recently been human soldiers began, slowly and with tremendous pain, to not be dead. The I-Core was working. The I-Core was always working. But here is what nobody, not even the scientists who developed the primordial I-Core in a classified lab buried beneath the Wasatch Mountains in Utah, had ever fully understood about what it does to a human body at the moment of vaporization. It doesn't rebuild you. It improves you, and the improvement isn't optional. The first thing Damon Reyes experienced when awareness returned was not pain. Pain is a biological signal. Pain requires intact nerve endings, functional synapses, a nervous system that knows where it is and what it is attached to. Pain requires a body that is still, in some recognizable way, organized. What Damon experienced was something that the human language has no precise word for, a sensation of reconvergence. like being an ocean that had been scattered as mist across 100 miles and was now, drop by drop, remembering how to be water again. He was everywhere at once, and then he was here. And the transition between those two states took, according to the quantum displacement clock embedded in what had been his combat harness, 47 minutes. 47 minutes of the primordial I-core doing what it does. Here is what the I-core is, stripped of the classified language and the euphemisms that Space Command uses in its restricted briefings. The primordial I-core is a biosynthetic compound developed in 2387 by a research team working under Project LAZARUS, a black-budget initiative that most of Congress still believes was a weather prediction program. The core mechanism is this. The I-core contains engineered prion-like proteins capable of recognizing and bonding with human DNA fragments at the quantum level. It doesn't need a body to work. It needs information. Human DNA, even scattered across a stellar debris field as component atoms, carries within its quantum structure an imprint, the biological echo of the individual it once coded for. The I-core finds those echoes, and then it rebuilds, not with the original materials, not with the soft, efficient, vulnerability-plagued architecture of standard human biology. The I-core rebuilds with whatever is available, and in the cooling wake of a supernova, what is available is the richest mineral bath in the known universe. Stellar nucleosynthesis, the process by which dying stars forge heavy elements, had scattered the debris field with iron, tungsten, osmium, iridium, and a suite of exotic transuranic materials that exist nowhere else in nature. The I-core used all of it. Damon Reyes assembled himself out of the dead star's exhalation, and as each piece of him came together, it came together denser. His bones didn't reform as calcium phosphate. They reformed as calcium-tungsten-iridium composite lattices, each femur carrying 50 times the tensile strength of the original. His musculature didn't reform as standard human tissue. It reformed as a hybrid fiber matrix. Each cell threaded with conductive metallic proteins that drew energy from ambient electromagnetic radiation. His skin didn't come back as skin. It came back as a 3-millimeter dense metal dermal layer, still warm, still flexible, still recognizably his, but carrying a hardness rating that would blunt a standard military combat knife. His eyes came back last. They came back different. When Damon Reyes opened his eyes in the void, no helmet, no suit. In the naked vacuum of deep space, where a human being should last approximately 90 seconds before cerebral hypoxia claimed them, he found that he could breathe. Not because he had lungs that processed oxygen, because the I-core had given him something better, a closed-loop metabolic system that extracted energy directly from stellar radiation and converted it to biological fuel. He didn't need oxygen anymore. He didn't need food. He didn't need water. He didn't need warmth. He was warmth. He was radiation. He was a $3 million weapons platform in a 6'2" human frame, and he was absolutely furious. But fury would have to wait. Because the reconstruction, for all its terrible elegance, was not without cost. The psychological toll came the way that all truly catastrophic things come, not with a roar, but with a whisper. Damon floated in the debris field. He could float, he discovered. The dense metal composition of his new body interacted with the electromagnetic field of the dead star's remnant in ways that gave him a rudimentary, imprecise ability to manipulate his own movement in zero-G, and he looked at his hands. His hands were his hands. His fingerprints were his fingerprints. The scar on his right palm from a training accident in Fort Bragg's obstacle course when he was 22 years old was still there, but traced now in silver-white scar tissue that glinted in the starlight. He thought about his mother in Savannah, Georgia, who kept a photo of him in his dress uniform on the mantel above the fireplace. He thought about whether she would recognize him now. He thought about whether he was still the kind of thing that had a mother, whether the concept of a mother applied to something that had been vaporized and reassembled from stellar debris. He thought about Staff Sergeant Keisha Liang, who had the bunk across from his on the Unbroken Covenant, who could quote every lyric of every Kendrick Lamar album in chronological order, and who had been talking about retiring to open a bakery in Portland after this deployment. Keisha Liang had evaporated at 700 hours, 36 seconds into a supernova. There was no amount of primordial ichor in the universe that was going to give her a bakery in Portland. The grief hit Damon Ray's like a fist between his shoulder blades, and he let it hit him because he was still human enough to need it. He floated in the cooling stellar graveyard, and he felt it. The weight of 37,000 dead. The weight of 312 ships that were now component atoms. The weight of a mission that had failed so catastrophically that it had taken a star to fail it. He floated and he grieved, and then he stopped grieving, because grief was for after. Right now there were 6 others somewhere in this debris field, and there were saboteurs. And there was a reckoning that hadn't happened yet. Damon oriented his new senses, senses that extended beyond visible light, beyond infrared, into the radio and microwave and X-ray bands simultaneously, and he searched. He found Commander Hargrove first, 300 kilometers to his port side, assembling herself out of the debris field like a storm pulling itself together over warm water. Then Domings Park and Williams and Ockafer and Sol Park with her sniper's patients, still somehow intact even in reconstruction. Then Dr. Elias, who would later tell him that she had spent her reconstruction time cataloging the biological data, streaming through the ichor's feedback loops. Turning her own reassembly into a research project, because that was, apparently, what you did when you were a trauma surgeon and you needed to not fall apart. 6, he found 6. The 7th, the one with no name in any record, no rank that could be spoken, had already found them. And she was broadcasting on a frequency that shouldn't have been possible from a human throat. A low bone-deep vibration that bypassed Damon's ears entirely and resonated in his rebuilt sternum. "I've got the signal," it said. "I know where the trigger came from. Form up." The debris field stretched 400 million kilometers in every direction. Damon had no frame of reference for what he was looking at until his new visual processing, operating simultaneously across 17 frequency bands, compiled the scatter data and overlaid it against the 7th Armada's last known formation map. Then he understood the scale of it, and understanding it was briefly the worst thing that had ever happened to him. Here was the manifest doctrine, the command carrier, 2 kilometers of reinforced battle steel now distributed as a vapor trail 16 million kilometers long. Its atoms slowly dispersing into the interstellar medium. Here was the principled resistance, the heavy cruiser that had been Domings Park's ship. Its reactor core a perfect sphere of fused metal the size of a sedan that had flash-cooled in the vacuum. Here were the personal effects, not as junk, not as trash, but as a cathedral of human presence spread across half a light second of dead space. Uniform patches, boot soles. The flash-frozen remains of 20,000 meals worth of protein rations. A guitar string. A child's birthday card, its message still legible on paper that had somehow, impossibly, survived by being in the shadow of a hull plate at the exact right moment. "Happy 40th birthday, Dad." "Come home safe." Brix Ockefer saw that card. He was floating 300 meters from Damon when he saw it, and his rebuilt body, 7 feet tall now, shoulders like a linebacker augmented with half a ton of stellar iron. Hands that could crush a standard combat helmet, went completely still. And then Brix Ockefer, gunnery sergeant, United Earth Marines, veteran of 11 engagements and 3 confirmed alien contact events, made a sound that was very small and very human, and that nobody commented on. There were no bodies. That was the thing that kept snagging in Damon's thoughts like a fishhook. There were no bodies because there had been no deaths in any conventional sense. No fall, no impact, no moment of biological failure. 37,000 people had simply ceased to be solid at the same moment. The stellar event had been so total, so absolute, that it had skipped past the normal catalog of fatal injuries entirely. There was nothing to grieve over in any physical sense. There was only the absence, a void shaped exactly like 37,000 human beings, sitting inside a void shaped exactly like 312 ships. Inside a void shaped exactly like the last hope of a species that was very far from home. Commander Hargrove called them together on the secure ichor-resonance channel, a communication method none of them had been briefed on, that seemed to have come as part of the reconstruction package. Biological transmitters woven into their rebuilt vocal cords that broadcast on a frequency only another ico-reconstructed individual could receive. They gathered in a rough sphere formation, 7 people floating in the literal ashes of a civilization's military reach. Hargrove looked different. She'd always been tall, always carried herself with the contained energy stillness of someone who had spent 20 years choosing very carefully when to move and when to be absolutely motionless. Now she was taller, 6'5", where she'd been 6 feet even, her density noticeably greater. Her surface radiating a faint bioluminescent pulse at the edges of her hands and collarbone, where the ichor's conductive protein sat closest to the surface. Her eyes, which had been brown, were now a deep amber gold, and they processed light the way no human eye had ever processed it before. She looked, Damon thought, like something that had been human once and had decided to keep the best parts. "Roll call," she said, and her voice, even through the bone resonance channel, had not lost an ounce of command authority. If anything, it had more. They responded in turn: Ray's, Domings Park. Williams, Akafer, Sol Park, Elias. And then the 7th, Wraith, who did not give a name but whose presence registered on every one of their rebuilt sensory arrays like a cold pressure behind the eyes. "Status," Hargrove said. The situation was this: they were alive, they were functional. They were, by every standard of conventional warfare, unarmed, unarmored, unequipped, and operating in an environment that had just demonstrated a willingness to kill on a stellar scale. They had no ships, they had no communication with Space Command. They had no extraction protocol, because no extraction protocol existed for this, because this had never happened before. Because the official position of the United Earth Armed Forces was that the primordial ichor had never been developed, and the black cases under their combat harnesses had never existed and Project LAZARUS was a weather prediction program. What they had, 7 rebuilt bodies that no longer required life support, 7 sensory arrays that between them could map a stellar system in real time. 7 rebuilt combat minds operating at processing speeds that made standard human cognition look like a dial-up connection. And Wraith's signal lock on a transmission frequency coming from somewhere inside the debris field, a narrowband, tight-beam broadcast that had been initiated approximately 4 seconds before the supernova and was still transmitting, on a loop targeted at a receiver 40 light-years away, in a system that Space Command star charts flagged as uninhabited. The Vethkai didn't operate alone in that system. Somebody had told them when to push the button, and that somebody's equipment was still right here, buried in the debris. Sol Park, quiet, patient, with the stillness that comes from having spent 200 hours lying motionless behind a scoped weapon waiting for a target to present itself, was the one who spotted it first. Not with her eyes, with her rebuilt electromagnetic sense, which had given her a passive detection range that made her original sniper's eye look like a child's magnifying glass. 3.7 kilometers bearing 040, she said. It's a signal buoy, military grade, human military grade, and it's transmitting in our encrypt. She stopped. It's transmitting in our encryption keys. The silence that followed was the specific silence of people absorbing information that changes what the last 20 years of their lives meant. Someone gave the Vethkai our encryption keys, Hargrove said, not a question. A statement, each word placed down like a stone being laid in a wall. Sir, Tekoa Williams said, and he was a big man even before the reconstruction had added 6 inches and 200 pounds to his frame, and his voice was very careful. The signal buoy is also running a timer. Countdown or elapsed? Countdown. Hargrove's rebuilt amber eyes moved to Wraith. Wraith's expression was the expression of someone who has already done the math and doesn't like the answer. 4 hours, Wraith said. Then it sends a second signal. I think it's a confirmation of kill transmission. If Space Command doesn't receive it, if whatever asset the traitor had in position doesn't confirm the fleet is gone, the Vethkai may not move on the next target. What's the next target? Domings Park asked. Wraith looked at her with eyes that had no whites left, just deep, reflective black from lid to lid, the way the reconstruction had left them. The signals routed through a relay station in Proxima Centauri B's orbital ring, Wraith said. the relay station that handles all incoming and outgoing communication for Earth Colony 1, 12 million people, the largest human settlement outside the home system. 12 million people who woke up this morning not knowing that the fleet assigned to protect them had been erased, and who had 4 hours before whatever came next. Damon Reyes felt something happen in his rebuilt chest, in the composite lattice sternum, and the conductive fiber cardiac muscle and the dense metal ribcage around it. He felt something that was too big for anger and too focused for grief, and that the I-Corps, apparently, had decided to keep as part of the upgrade package. It was the specific, cold, patient intent that turns a soldier from a person into a weapon. "Then we have 4 hours," he said, "and we have their frequency. And we know what they look like on sensor." He looked at the debris field around them, 400 million kilometers of shattered ships and human lives, slowly cooling in the dark. "And I know exactly what I want to use to build the guns." They built the weapons from the dead. It felt right, in a way that Damon didn't try to intellectualize. The 7th Armada had been a nation in motion. That was the phrase his drill sergeant had used at Fort Bragg when Damon was 20 years old, and everything about the military still felt like mythology. A nation in motion carries its identity in its bones, and the bones of this nation were still here, scattered across half a light second of cooling space. The hull plating of the Unbroken Covenant, 4 inches of nanolaminated titanium carbon composite. The specific grade used in space, Command's Generation 7 battle cruiser class, had survived the supernova in fragments. Because it was supposed to survive supernovas. Not a direct supernova, not at this range, nothing could survive that. But the outer hull plates, tumbling and spinning away from the thermal front at the moment of detonation, had caught just enough shadow from the main hull mass to cool a fraction of a degree below critical vaporization threshold before the wave passed. The fragments were hot, not to Damon. His rebuilt dermal layer processed temperatures up to several thousand degrees as mild warmth, but hot in the electromagnetic sense, still radiating. He could feel them in his hands when he collected them, the way a blacksmith feels iron fresh from the forge, and what he felt was not heat but potential. Doctor. Elias, who had spent her reconstruction cataloging data, and had emerged from the process with a scientific understanding of the I-Corps' mechanics, that the Utah lab scientists would have wept to hear. Explained what she'd worked out while they built. "The I-Corps doesn't just rebuild your body," she said, working a piece of hull plating with her hands, with the focused precision of a surgeon who now had grip strength, capable of bending solid steel bars. "It establishes a metabolic interface between your biological systems and certain metallic composites. The conductive proteins in our musculature, they're not just energy-harvesting structures. They're bonding agents. We can work this material." She wasn't speaking metaphorically. The 7 of them, 8, if the traitor was out there watching, could shape the salvaged hull plating with their hands. Not easily, not quickly, and it wasn't painless. The process felt like a full-body workout conducted at maximum exertion for hours on end. The dense metal musculature burning hot with the effort. Their rebuilt metabolisms cycling at full rate. Pulling electromagnetic energy from the dead star's still powerful remnant radiation. But they could do it. Working together, trading pieces between them when a set of hands fatigued, they could bend and form and work the material into shapes. The shapes they chose were informed by a combined 112 years of military experience. Brix Acaffer had been an armorer before combat promotion sent him to the gunline. He designed the primary weapons, long-rail accelerator assemblies, 3 feet in length, powered by a thumb-sized sliver of the I-Corps formula encased in hull plate housing. The I-Corps, when excited by the specific electromagnetic frequency, the dead star was still broadcasting, produced a directed energy discharge that Elias estimated, conservatively, at 700 megajoules per pulse. A standard military rail cannon produced 3. Sol Park designed her own, longer, more precise. The barrel-to-breech ratio tuned for the kind of range where her rebuilt sensory array could track a target's thermal signature, and the weapon could reach out across 20,000 kilometers of vacuum to touch it. She spent 40 minutes on the barrel alignment alone, her enhanced eyes working at the millimeter scale, hands as steady as they had always been, but now steadier for being made of stellar iron. "I can hit a 3-meter target at 40,000 kilometers in this radiation environment," she said, examining her work. "You could always hit a 3-meter target at 2,000 kilometers," Damon said. "Exactly," she said. "So now I don't miss." Williams and Domingspark built the close combat hardware, short. Brutal implements that looked like nothing in the standard military catalog, because the standard military catalog had been designed for beings with human physical limitations. These were designed for bodies that could survive a point-blank plasma discharge and punch through 2 inches of battle steel plating. The scaling was different. The weight was enormous by human standards and irrelevant to the people who would carry them. Hargrove directed and did not build. Her role had not changed. She stood slightly apart from the work, and she thought, and she planned, and she watched the debris field with her amber eyes and the 7 overlapping sensor arrays she'd been rebuilt with. And she built something more important than any weapon. She built the hunt. The Vethkai operated in swarm configurations, the biological reality of a hive mind species expressing itself through tactical doctrine. Individual units were fast, relatively fragile by military hardware standards, and absolutely deadly in numbers above 30. Below 30, they were still fast and still dangerous, but they lost the hive coherence that multiplied their individual combat effectiveness. The swarm configs required close proximity for the collective cognition to function at full capacity, within about 800 meters. The distributed neural processing of the hive could synchronize fully. Beyond that degradation, beyond 2 kilometers, individual Vethkai units were operating on locally cached behavioral programs, still formidable but predictable. The debris field was 800 million cubic kilometers of obstacles, sensor shadows, electromagnetic interference, and psychological terrain. It was the worst environment in the galaxy for a hive mind that needed proximity coherence, and it was home to 7 soldiers who had been rebuilt to operate in it. They moved through it like ghosts. Not metaphorically, literally, for the first time in the history of human military operation. A squad was moving through deep space without any physical signature that standard Vethkai sensor arrays could process. No body heat that stood out against the stellar remnant background. No electromagnetic emission above the dead star's constant broadcast. No oxygen exhaust, no thruster signature, no suit pressure, no suit radio. Just 7 dense metal human bodies navigating the debris field on electromagnetic manipulations, too subtle for anything other than another Ico-reconstructed being to detect. Wraith led them to the signal buoy. It was embedded in the wreckage of the Fort McHenry, a supply tender that had been close enough to a heavy cruiser at the moment of detonation that the larger ship's mass had absorbed enough of the thermal front to leave some of the tender's inner structure intact. Not much, but enough. The buoy was in what had been the tender's secure communications bay, still broadcasting its tight beam transmission on the trader's encrypted frequency. Counting down the minutes until it sent the kill confirmation that would put 12 million people in Colony 1 in the path of the Vethkai's next operation. Damon found the buoy's power coupling with his rebuilt hands and looked at Wraith. "Do we destroy it?" "No," Wraith said. "We use it." The plan that emerged from the next 40 minutes of planning was the kind of plan that only makes sense when the people planning it have very recently died and been rebuilt from stellar debris and have genuinely nothing left to lose. Wraith would rewrite the buoy's transmission, not the signal, not the encryption, but the content. Instead of a kill confirmation, she would send a distress signal. Not the standard Vethkai request format, but something more specific, more urgent. A false report of a malfunction in the detonation sequence. A request for Vethkai command personnel to come to the debris field to verify the kill in person. "They won't come themselves," Hargrove said. "No," Wraith agreed. "They'll send a verification team. Between 8 and 20 units, small enough to navigate the debris field, large enough to carry command authority." She paused. "Which means the hive leaders, the Vethkai command caste. The ones who actually ordered this." The silence that followed had a different quality than the earlier silences. It was not the silence of grief. It was not the silence of shock. It was the silence of 7 people who had been rebuilt from the bones of a dead star, looking at each other across the wreckage of 37,000 lives, and reaching a shared, wordless, absolute agreement. "How long until they arrive?" Hargrove asked. "At standard transit speed from their nearest staging system," Wraith calculated. 11 hours. "Then we have 11 hours," Hargrove said. "I want positions established at these coordinates." She broadcast the targeting data through the bone resonance channel. "Sol, you have overwatch from the Manifest Doctrine's reactor core. It's the densest single object in the field. It'll give you angle on the entire approach corridor." Sol Park was already moving. "Bricks, you and Williams have the center." "If anything gets past Sol, nothing gets past Sol," Bricks said. "If anything gets past Sol," Hargrove repeated, with the patient precision of someone who plans for the world as it is rather than the world as it should be. "You end it in the center. Domings Park, Elias, you have the flanks. Use the wreckage as cover and don't let them reach hive coherence range." "If they synchronize?" "They won't," Domings Park said, and there was something in her voice that was not quite a promise and not quite a threat and was entirely convincing. "Rays," Hargrove's amber eyes found him in the dark. "You're with me?" "And Wraith?" Damon asked. Wraith had already disappeared into the debris field. There was a 15-meter section of the Manifest Doctrine's drive plating, still hull temperature warm, blunt-edged, as big as a mid-size apartment, drifting slowly 300 meters away. And Wraith was behind it, invisible to every sensor, silent on every frequency, and Damon could feel the cold pressure of her presence the way you feel a change in air pressure before a storm. "Wraith is where Wraith needs to be," Hargrove said, and then they waited. 11 hours in deep space is a very long time when you are made of stellar iron and running at full metabolic rate on electromagnetic radiation from a dead star. Long enough to think. Long enough to run through the math, the number of dead, the number of ships, the number of missions that would never be completed, the number of letters that would never be sent home. Long enough to remember that you are still, under everything the I-Corps had done to you, still the thing your drill sergeant meant when he set a nation in motion. Long enough to remember that nations don't stop moving just because they've taken a hit. The traitor's name was Major Selim Voss. Damon learned this 14 seconds before the ambush began. When Wraith's bone resonance broadcast came through in a burst of compressed information, the quantum-decrypted contents of the signal buoy's transmission log. 4 months of tight beam communication between Major Selim Voss of Space Command Intelligence and a Vethkai Command collective designated voice of the Eternal Bloom. Selim Voss, Space Command Intelligence. Decorated officer, 2 tour in the Belt conflict, 3 citations for distinguished service, family from Ohio. Dog named Archie that he posted pictures of on the Space Command internal social network. Selim Voss, who had for 4 months been providing the voice of the Eternal Bloom with human fleet movements, encryption keys, position data, and a single piece of information that had made the Cygnus 7 massacre possible. The precise gravitational resonance frequency required to externally collapse a main sequence, star's magnetic containment field. Selim Voss, who was currently alive in the debris field, I-Corps built and radiodark, having fed the ambush team's positions to the Vethkai while everyone slept. And Selim Rebecca, who had, in his very last transmission before going dark, added 3 words to the end of the kill confirmation signal that changed the context of everything. They are alive. The Vethkai hadn't come to verify a kill, they'd come to finish one. 63 Vethkai combat units emerged from the debris field at 4:11 hours ship standard time, in a 7-point encirclement pattern optimized for collapsing a linear human defensive formation. They were fast, faster than anything that size had a right to be. Their insected limbs folded flat against their bodies as they moved in zero-G with a terrifying, fluid efficiency, using the debris field itself as cover and propulsion, pushing off hull fragments and reactor casings, and the frozen remains of human ships with 4-limbed grace that made them look like something between a predator and a dance. They came out of the dark already in coherence range, already synchronized, and Sol Park was already shooting. The first Vethkai unit ceased to exist at a range of 38,000 kilometers. a distance so extreme that even the enhanced sensors of the other 6 soldiers registered it as a statistical impossibility. Soul Park, supine across the manifest doctrine's fused reactor core. Left eye closed, right eye interfaced with the ultra-long barrel she'd spent 40 minutes aligning to the millimeter. Had simply reached across the void and taken the problem out of the equation. Then she reached again, and again, and again. The encirclement fractured on the left vector, 6 units gone in the first 11 seconds. The hive coherence wavered. Soul was targeting, with the specific strategic awareness of someone who had studied Vethkai tactical behavior for her entire military career. The command frequency emitters that allowed individual units to participate in collective cognition. She wasn't just killing Vethkai. She was deafening them, cutting the neural links that allowed the swarm to function as a single distributed intelligence, stranding individual units in the isolation of their locally cached behavioral programs. Isolated Vethkai ran in straight lines. Brix Okafer and Tekoa Williams were standing in straight lines. The center of the debris field became, briefly, a very loud and very bright place. The rail accelerator weapons the 2 men had built for themselves discharged in rapid sequence, each 700 megajoule pulse visible across the entire debris field as a directed flash of light. The impacts against Vethkai combat units producing secondary explosions as the compressed biological matter of the hive beasts vaporized and expanded outward. Domings Park and Elias took the flanks. Unez Domings Park, Corporal. Ship's Engine Division. The woman who had spent her pre-military life in East LA working on her uncle's diesel trucks, and who had joined the Space Corps because it seemed like the biggest, most complicated engine in existence, and she wanted to understand how it worked, moved through the debris field on the right flank with a terrifying efficiency that was entirely, characteristically hers. She had built her weapon short and chose to use it that way, inside 8 meters, her reconstructed body absorbing impacts that would have killed a suit of powered armor. Her dense metal frame punching through Vethkai combat carapace with the same energy she'd once applied to removing a stripped bolt from a drive shaft housing. She was not angry, she was precise. The distinction made her more dangerous than the anger would have. Dr. Mara Elias was angry. Mara Elias had spent 17 years of her career doing everything in her power to prevent human beings from dying. She had been good at it. Extraordinarily, statistically improbably good at it. With a combat mortality rate across 4 deployments that was half the fleet average, and had earned her 3-unit commendations, and the informal title among her patients of the woman death sends its. Regrets, too, she had understood. Going into the Space Corps, that soldiers died. She had dedicated herself to minimizing that reality, to pushing back against it with every tool medicine and training and sheer stubborn competence could provide. 37,000 people had died in 0.0003 seconds. No triage, no intervention, no chance, just gone. Mara Elias moved through the left flank of the Vethkai encirclement, and she brought with her the concentrated, specific fury of a healer who had been denied the chance to heal. And the Vethkai units she encountered found that there was something worse than facing a soldier who wanted to kill them. There was facing someone who knew exactly where every vital structure was. And then there was Damon Reyes and Commander Hargrove and the part of the debris field where the ambush wasn't. Because ambushes always have a center. A directing mind, even in a hive, needs a position. The voice of the eternal Bloom, the Vethkai command cast entity that had orchestrated the Cygnus 7 massacre, that had cultivated Selim Voss for 4 months, that had invested the resources of an 11-system hive collective in the elimination of a single human fleet, had positioned itself at the notional center of the encirclement. Far enough from the combat to maintain coherence broadcast range, close enough to observe and redirect. Hargrove had known this. She had planned for it. She had placed herself and Damon in the one position in the debris field, where a line from the encirclement centroid ran clean through the largest remaining hull section of the manifest doctrine. They were waiting behind the target's sight line. They came out of the dead ship's shadow at full acceleration, a physical feat that, before the I-Corps, would have required a thruster suit at minimum, and would have produced detectable electromagnetic emissions. In their rebuilt forms, with their dense metal musculature generating M fields that they were slowly learning to direct rather than merely emit, they moved in the vacuum the way their enemies did. Fast, silent, from an angle the voice of the eternal bloom had not accounted for. The voice was enormous, twice the mass of a standard Vethkai combat unit, its compound eyes burning the deep ember red of command-cast neurological overdrive. 4 of its 6 limbs occupied with the coherence broadcast arrays that connected it to its 63 subordinates. It was surrounded by 8 personal guard units that died in the first 4 seconds as Sol Park, having rotated Overwatch target priority on Wraith's coded signal, reached across the debris field. With specific and absolute precision. Then it was just Damon and Hargrove and the architect of 37,000 deaths. What happened in the next 45 seconds is something that the official record will note as direct engagement resulting in termination of primary hostile command element. The language is adequate, in the way that the phrase, "a star went out," is adequate to describe what happened to the 7th Armada. True, complete in the technical sense, missing every single thing that matters. What matters is that Commander Alexis Hargrove, who had given the order that saved 7 people and could not save 37,000, looked at the voice of the eternal bloom and said, in the bone resonance frequency that no Vethkai could hear, "This is for the iron gospel." And Damon Reyes, who was not angry and was not precise and was somewhere past both of those things, operating in the cold, patient space that exists on the other side of grief when grief has finished with you, said nothing at all. Because some things don't need words, the cleanup, for lack of a better term, took 3 hours, 63 Vethkai combat units, 1 command cast entity, 1 signal buoy disabled and disassembled, and Major Selim Voss, who was found in the wreckage of the Fort McHenry exactly where Wraith had predicted, still radiodark, crouched behind a section of battle steel plating, as if something as thin as that could hide a rebuilt soldier from 6 others who could track a heat signature across light years. Voss tried to run. In the debris field, with 6 Icor-reconstructed soldiers between him and every exit vector. In the electromagnetic shadow of a dead star that was actively interfering with the only kind of navigation a standard human mind, even a rebuilt one. Even with all the Icor's upgrades, could perform under stress, running was an act of profound and total desperation. It lasted approximately 40 seconds. Wraith brought him to ground in the shadow of the Manifest Doctrine's port drive housing, and when the others arrived, Voss was restrained with lengths of hull cable Williams had salvaged. And Wraith was standing over him with her black eyes and her expressionless face, and the only sound in the universe was Voss breathing too fast and the soft, constant radiation hiss of the dead star. "How many more?" Hargrove asked. Voss said nothing. "The relay in Proxima Centauri B's orbital ring," Hargrove said. "The one that handles Colony 1 communications." "Who maintains it?" Voss's jaw was set in the specific way of someone who has decided something. "We have time," Damon said quietly, not a threat, a fact. "We have a lot of time, Voss. We don't get hungry, we don't get cold, we don't get tired. We can wait for you to decide to talk for years if that's what it takes." He paused. "Can you?" Voss looked at them, 7 rebuilt soldiers in the wreckage of everything he'd helped destroy, and something in his face changed. Not broke, changed. The way stone changes when water has been running over it long enough. He talked. The relay in Colony 1's orbital ring had 3 handlers. All recruited by a network Voss identified only as the Consortium. Human operatives embedded throughout Space Command at various levels, motivated by various things. All operating in service of a single shared belief, that humanity's expansion into the galaxy was unsustainable, that conflict with species like the Vethkai would inevitably end in human extinction, and that the correct response to this was negotiated capitulation. Territory, resources, retreat, in exchange for survival measured in generations rather than victories. The Consortium had decided, without consulting the 12 billion human beings whose lives they were trading away, that survival was a better deal than the alternative. The 6 handlers in 3 other star systems, 2 more signal buoys, One more stellar event already in preparation, targeting a colony in the Tau Ceti system with a population of 4 million. Hargrove listened to all of it. She recorded all of it through the biological data storage architecture the I-Core had built into her rebuilt brain. A capacity she would later discover was perfect, error-free, unalterable. A record that would survive anything short of another supernova. Then she looked at the 7 of them, the only surviving members of the Iron Gospel, the only I-Core-reconstructed soldiers in existence, the only people who knew what she knew. "We're not going home," she said. "Not yet." Nobody argued. Nobody looked surprised, because the math was obvious and they'd all done it already and the answer came out the same every time. 37,000 dead, 4 million more in danger. A conspiracy embedded in the command structure of the only military force, standing between humanity and the species that had just demonstrated a willingness to kill on a stellar scale. 7 soldiers who didn't need air, didn't need food, didn't need ships, didn't need backup, and had just proven that they could operate in conditions that erased conventional military hardware as thoroughly as the supernova had erased the fleet. 7 soldiers who were, in the honest technical sense, no longer quite human, but human enough. Human in the ways that mattered, in the memory of 37,000 names, in the weight of a dead star's iron pressed into rebuilt bones. In the cold and patient intent that turns a person into a weapon. In the knowledge that 12 billion people were going about their lives right now, sleeping, eating, arguing about trivial things. Loving their dogs and their children and their coffee mugs from diners in Nashville, without knowing how close the dark was getting. 7 soldiers who had been given an impossible survival by a forbidden compound and had decided, with the specific stubbornness of a species that looks at a galaxy that doesn't want it alive and shows up anyway, to spend that survival on something worth spending it on. "I need 2 things," Wraith said, and for the first time the note in her voice was not cold. It was almost something warmer. "The consortium's full network map," Hargrove said. "I already have it from Voss," Wraith said. "What I need is permission." Hargrove looked at her for a moment, then